Good morning. We are aware this is a time of stress. For the next few minutes, let this be Slidell Magazines and my opportunity to bring just a little relief and relaxation. I invite you to sit down, take a deep breath, relax, forget about those things that are beyond your control, and listen. Listen as I read you one of the stories from the Slidell Magazine collection. Today our story is titled Diggers. It is one of the earlier stories that I wrote after we parted from doing historical pieces. This particular piece, even though I did not write it for that purpose, later became a one-act play and was presented as a comedy. So, here we go. Diggers. No one knew where they came from. Some said from just across the state line in Louisiana. One day in the mid-1950s, they just appeared and inquired about renting a shack on my grandpa's place. At first, Grandpa was reluctant to rent it, telling them that it was not fit to live in. I remember the place, and even the poorest folks had long abandoned it for better shelter. Finally, an agreement was reached. They would rent it for $1 per month, but there was to be no drinking. They said their names were Zeke and Ralph Dixon, and they were brothers. They had no trade, but hired out to do any type work that needed to be done. We would find out later they were talented at digging graves, ditches, or whatever needed to be dug with a pick and a shovel. We soon began to call them the Shovel Brothers. Zeke was the oldest. He must have been about 25 years old at the time, and his brother was about 20 years old. Zeke spoke and negotiated the work for the pair, and over time they became dependable day laborers used by a number of farmers and contractors in the area. They were both tall and lanky and wore overalls, but showed up for work each day with clean clothes and well groomed. You could tell there was something different about them. They had too much class to be ditch diggers, but not enough drive and determination to be much of anything else. They spoke good English, at least better than most of the people who hired them. It was assumed that they had come from a family with some means, who had long given up on trying to make anything out of them. If you've never used a shovel, there's a talent to doing it correctly. You don't have to be real strong, but the timing has to be important. You have to thrust the shovel with your arms and shoulders at just the right angle to the earth. You then follow up with a push of your leg and foot on the top of the shovel. There's an old saying that to be a proper laborer, you had to let your tools work for you. In this case, their tools were their shovels, and they were proper diggers. One thing noticeable about them was that Zeke was right-handed and left-footed, and Ralph was left-handed and right-footed. This allowed them to dig side by side and not interfere with each other's motions. Boy, could those guys move dirt. They never caused any problems, never stole, lived up to the rental agreement by not drinking, did not curse, and were always respectful of the ladies regardless of age. They were different, however, and as with all people who are different, people began to gossip about them. Some said they were not brothers, but homosexual lovers. Others said they must have had criminal backgrounds, but the only factual fault that anyone could point to was that they would not go to church, any church. The Methodist tried, the Baptist tried, the Pentecostal took a shot at them, but none had any success. You could see the shack from where I lived. It was on one hill and I lived on another. One night, a friend and I must have been about 11 at the time, camped out in my front yard. As kids do, we stayed up all night telling ghost stories and the like. It was a bright moonlit night, and in the field across the highway we could see movement of the two figures as they walked up the hill toward their house. Each had a shovel on his shoulder. As our imagination ran wild, this confirmed to my friend and me that they must be grave robbers. We took an extra interest in camping that summer so as to watch them more closely. Each Friday and Saturday night, they would repeat the routine, leaving about midnight and returning home at about 4 in the morning. A couple of years passed, and one day, for no particular reason, I rode my bicycle up the abandoned driveway to their house. It was about a quarter of a mile long, and no car had rolled on that dirt in years. The brothers certainly had no car, or much use for one either. Although they had done odd jobs for my family, we had spoken very little, and we barely knew one another. In fact, they spoke very little to anyone. As I approached the house, I could hear conversation from within and realized they were home. I had not expected this, so I turned the ride away. From the front porch, Zeke yelled, "Johnny?" I stopped. They motioned for me to come to the house, and I reluctantly did. To my surprise, they were as cordial as they could be. The house was clean and neat. It still had no running water or electricity, but for what it was, they had done their best. I suppose they needed a friend, and I found their oddness interesting. So as strange as it seems, over time we became friends. I visited fairly often, but I never felt comfortable enough to ask them about their midnight trips. For some time, a strange thing had been happening in the community. A landowner would stumble on a pit dug in a remote part of his property. The pit would be huge, but there was no possibility of backhoes or bulldozers being at the site. The trees around the site were not disturbed, and they were miles from the nearest road. The sheriff and the county agent came, but no one had any idea for the reason of the digging. This had happened in several places. My friend and I never related to anyone about seeing Zeke and Ralph leaving and returning during the night. A few years passed, many more hoes. It occurred to me that it had to be them. By this time I knew them well and knew that I was probably the only friend they had. I decided I would ask them on the next visit, and I did. I told them I knew that they went somewhere every Friday and Saturday night with their shovels. They looked at each other, but they never answered. It was as if they never heard the question, and the rest of the afternoon, the visit was very uncomfortable. I decided that I'd crossed the line on our friendship and felt it would be better if I did not come back, or at least not come back for a while. The next afternoon, as I got off my bicycle, I heard Zeke yell as he motioned for me to come to the house. Then they told me. They told me of the treasures that was buried long ago somewhere on our section of land where we lived. A section is a parcel of land about 1 mile long and 1 mile wide. They would not tell me how they knew, but they did tell me what to look for. If it was virgin forest, look for an area of younger trees. The trees would be large, but not as large as the virgin timber. They also said to look for a lone cedar tree growing in an unusual place, like deep in a pine or oak forest, or a large tree limb that had been scarred by a rope or a chain as it lowered the heavy loot into the hole. There had been rumors of buried treasure all over South Mississippi, and the Shovel brothers were not the only ones to try to dig for it. Someone once dug up my grandpa's turnip patch in search of it. Some say that the Copeland gang buried their treasure near our place, but they operated over around Hattiesburg. That was too far east. Some say it was the Mural gang that plundered the Travelers of the Natchez Trace, but that was probably too far to the west. Some said it was Jean Lafitte, who sailed up the Pearl River out of Lake Pontchartrain and took smaller boats laden with the treasure up the Bogachitta River, burying it on the banks nearby. Then there was a story of Mr. Gill, who lived just up the road. He buried his gold, money, and silverware somewhere on Gill Creek to keep the Yankees from finding it. I never told their secret, and they continued to dig. I grew up and moved away from Bogachitta, and I seldom returned. After some time, the old house was abandoned, and later it was torn down. Last month, I read an obituary in the Brookhaven newspaper. It was the obituary of Zeke Dixon. Zeke Dixon passed away last Monday at the age of 76. He was preceded in death by his brother Ralph. He has no known survivors. Services are incomplete at this time. Just last week, I got a call from an old friend in Brookhaven who's an attorney. He said it was important that he needed to see me. When we met, he said that Zeke had left a will and stated that I was the only friend he and his brother ever had. The attorney handed me a sealed envelope. I waited until I was in the car to open it. Inside was $25,000 in cash and a handwritten note. In scratchy writing from calloused hands caused by decades of hard work, it read, "We found it.